with one another, alhamdulillah. And all of us, inshallah. May Allah make us,
Inshallah.
make all of us have fish liver together, inshallah.
Mm.
I mean,
All right, guys, we are live, so we'll go ahead and get started. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, my embraced family. Welcome to our weekly Wednesday discussion, in which this week we are discussing the introduction chapter of the book that we are going over as a group, the Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And as we've mentioned for the past couple weeks, we are going over this book in order to kind of help educate ourselves on the issue of mass incarcerations and how the issue of mass incarcerations especially affects the African American community. This book was written back in 2010, but especially due to the current dynamic and the current political climate, this book cannot be any more relevant. So last week we discussed the 2020 preface that is found within the 10th anniversary version of this book, in which the author just kind of goes over some of her reflections of how the book was then compared to its relevance now, some of the things that have changed, some of the things that have not changed, right? Just to kind of prepare us for how we should approach this book reading it now in 2020. And so now this week we're going to be starting going over the introduction chapter of the book. And like I mentioned previously, how it'll go is I'll just try and give a 15, 20-minute summary, if possible, of the chapter. While I'm doing that, for those of you who also read the chapter, want to chime in and kind of bring in their own perspective on a particular point I make, please don't hesitate. Like I mentioned before, we want this particular Wednesday discussion to be more of an engaged collective discussion, right? Not so much as a lecture from me, but more of like an engaged discussion with all of us. So please, throughout the summary, do feel free to chime in and kind of share your own thoughts or perspectives or something that from that chapter that you felt kind of hit you in a way that I didn't mention. So that's how we'll move forward with going over the chapters. So with that, I'll go ahead and highlight some key points that I have noted throughout the introduction chapter. And so this chapter starts with the author, Michelle Alexander, introducing us to a person who is named Jarvis Cotton. We're informed that this person named Jarvis Cotton is not able to vote. He has been denied the basic human right as an American citizen to participate in our electoral democracy. And she draws parallels to his inability to vote, to the inability to vote of his great-great-grandfather, who was able to vote to, of course, being a slave, his great-grandfather, who was beaten to death by a Ku Klux Klan member for daring to even try to vote, and his father, who was denied the right to vote due to the poll taxes and literacy tests, which were prevalent during the time of the Jim Crow era. And she highlights to us that just like his father and his father before him and his father before him, Jarvis is also not able to vote. Essentially highlighting for us that despite being at this time in 2010, after the Jim Crow era, after the era of slavery, things have not really changed for people like Jarvis. And she says that hundreds of years later, America is still not an egalitarian democracy. America is still not an equal democracy in her view. And so with that, she goes into some detail as to why Jarvis is not able to vote, which is the fact that he was incarcerated and convicted of a drug-related crime or a nonviolent crime and has the title of felon. And she discusses and explains to the reader that those who are given the title of felon, those who are convicted of a crime, are denied the basic human rights very similarly to the way that African Americans back then in our history of both the Jim Crow era and during the era of slavery were also denied basic human rights. She explains that while now it's no longer possible to explicitly racially discriminate racially discriminate against someone, it is legal to discriminate against somebody if they are convicted of a crime. And she goes into details about this, how they're discriminated against in terms of employment, housing, education, public benefits like food stamps, jury service, and of course, voting. And even today, we know that there are certain municipalities and states which don't allow those who are convicted to vote. And through this way, the author argues that while the Jim Crow laws, or how she explains the system of the racial caste system, she calls it, has not went away. She argues that the racial caste system has not been destroyed, but merely evolved and changed. And when we first hear this idea that there's still this racial discrimination system that exists in the U.S., or the racial caste system, as she calls it, when you first hear that, you're kind of taken aback. It really doesn't make sense at first. It kind of goes against what we are taught, and what we know from our culture and our society. Even she herself acknowledges this. So from here, the author goes into her own personal history. She describes when she was about to head to work at the ACLU. She saw a sign that said, "The war on drugs is the new Jim Crow." And when she saw this sign, she thought the same thing that many of us also might think when we first hear this idea that what the Jim Crow doesn't still exist. What do you mean the Jim Crow? This doesn't really make sense at first, right? She had that same feeling. She acknowledged that at that time, when she was working for the ACLU, while she acknowledged that there was racial bias in the criminal justice system, she felt saying that it was a racial caste system or a new Jim Crow was an extreme view, and that such a ridiculous view would not be taken seriously. And this view of hers didn't really change until she started actively working towards criminal justice reform. And when she exposed herself to the criminal justice system, got involved in criminal justice reform, it started becoming much more apparent to her that this accusation that she saw before, that the Jim Crow era is still around in a different form, and how there's still this racial caste system that is implemented within our country. Once she started getting involved in the issue of criminal justice reform, she started seeing the whole. She started identifying the indicators that made this claim have a lot more weight to it, right? And so from there, she starts speaking about how after she left the ACLU, she goes into more detail again about how exactly those who are convicted of a felony are denied basic human rights. She again speaks about how they're denied the right to vote, how they are denied many opportunities that essentially force them into a permanent second-class citizen status, right? Once you're hit with that felony on your record, you're done. You're never going to be on an equal setting as someone who has not been convicted, no matter what. Even after you paid your debts to society through being put in prison or being put on probation or house arrest or what have you, once you have that, felon on you as entitled, once you're convicted, you're basically done. That's just how it is. And this is kind of like her main point here. And so from here, after and if anyone has any questions, please feel free to jump in and ask. But after she discusses about the effects that mass incarceration have on individuals who are convicted of a felony, once they are considered a felon, the basic human rights they are denied. After that, she then starts to address some misconceptions on mass incarceration, right? So, for example, we know that mass incarcerations, as she mentions in the book, is the incarceration rate is much higher in the African American community than it is in any other community. And she addresses the misconception that the reason why mass incarceration is so high within the African American community is just due to the fact that they commit more drug-related offenses. They are exposed to more drugs than other races due to the fact they live in impoverished areas. Which this is something that I think a lot of us have heard on various occasions. But she basically debunks this claim by sharing with us some facts, right? So she shares with us some studies that show when it comes to drug-related offenses, it is essentially the same rate across the board. It's relatively similar of all races in America, whether you're black, white, Mexican, purple, green, what have you. For the most part, the use and selling of drugs, the rate of use, drug use and the drug selling is the same across the board. And on top of that, she cites a study which indicates that it could be argued that drug use is more rampant among white youth than it is among black youth. Despite that fact, black men are 25 times more likely to be convicted and incarcerated for a drug offense than a white man. 25 times. Just really take a second to think about that. 25 times more likely, despite the fact that the rate of use is virtually the same, perhaps even higher for the white man. And so telling us this is kind of really highlight to the reader that this is not just an issue of black people are using more drugs and that's why. That's just not a fact. There is something, she highlights to the reader that there is something considerably wrong here. And you have to acknowledge that if you have two groups of people who are doing something at similar rates, yet one is being incarcerated at a much higher and more frequent rate than the other, there's something that's off. And so she really highlights this for us as addressing one misconception. Another misconception that she addresses is when she speaks about the war on drugs, which was implemented during the Reagan era, right? During the time that Ronald Reagan was president. And most of us are familiar with this, the massive war on drugs campaign back when it implemented during the Reagan administration and all the commercials and programs that were implemented to really heavily highlight this issue. And the Reagan administration did a very excellent job in really bringing this awareness to the community, and really making the American community have this as a top priority for them. And it created this misconception that drug use was on the rise. But Michelle Alexander cites studies which indicate that when the war on drugs was first launched, right, illegal drug use was actually on the decline. So this idea that the war on drugs was launched in response to the increasing rate of drug use in the U.S. is not true. So she basically highlights that and talks about that to us. And from there, she speaks about at that particular time the current state of affairs by telling us that the U.S. penal population, due to the war on drugs, exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million people. More than 2 million people. That big of an increase. And the majority of these incarcerations were due to drug-related offenses. And so from there, she again goes into some of the rates that I mentioned before. How again, black men are 25 times more likely to be arrested for a drug-related crime than a white man, despite having similar rates of use. And she also tells us as many as 80% of young African American men now have, at that time, had criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. So 80% of, in major cities at that time, of African American, young African American males had that felon title put onto them. And as we discussed previously, and as Ms. Alexander discussed previously, once someone has that felon on them as a title, they are in a permanent second class status. And it's through these main points that she argues that mass incarceration, in her view, is a transformed version of Jim Crow. And from there, she starts speaking about it. I kind of want to spend a little bit of time on this. She starts speaking about the prison system, right? So in the introduction, towards the end of her introduction, she starts to discuss to the reader about the effectiveness of the prison system. And she cites some historical criminal scholars back then who used to argue and who felt that the prison system was doomed to eventually be replaced. And the reason that they gave was that it has been proven that the prison system was just not very effective. These scholars argued that the data showed that those who are put in prison have an increased likeness of committing a crime. Basically, those who are incarcerated have a higher chance of committing a crime again, and essentially calling into question the effectiveness of the prison system. That there was this growing consensus among these scholars that the prison system, in their view, just didn't work. It wasn't a good deterrent from people committing crimes, nor was it a good deterrent from those who were put in the prison system to learn from their mistakes and then not commit a crime when they leave. As a matter of fact, they argue that on the contrary, they felt that the prison system somehow reinforced their inclinations to commit crime. And so due to this, these scholars felt that, and of course she mentioned this was like back in like the early 1900s. She's into the 1970s, and they would argue this before the war on drugs really started to develop. We had more buildings of public prisons and what have you. But they felt that it was inevitable for prisons to be shut down because of its effectiveness. And she also cites a quote, cites the National Advisory Commission of Criminal Justice Standards and Goals, where they issued a recommendation in 1973 that no new institutions for adults should be built and existing institutions for juveniles should be closed. So, and I believe she shares with us all of this, even though this is a little bit off tangent, in my opinion, in regards to what this book about is as a whole. I think she highlights this to us as readers about the prison system to kind of encourage us as readers to kind of objectively take a step back and analyze and reflect on our prison system. Is it really as perfect as we think it to be? And while this may not be the best time to have a discussion here, since we're having a discussion about mass incarcerations right now, I do think this is a discussion worth having. Right? And I think it's a discussion that is difficult for us to have because we're taught from birth that our prison system is perfect. I remember when I was a kid, you watch the Saturday morning cartoons, you watch the superheroes beat the bad guys, right? What happens? They're thrown in jail, and the justice system, works again. The justice system is victorious again. We're kind of taught from a young age that our prison system is perfect. We're not taught to call it into question. And so I did find it interesting that she has a snippet here to kind of push us as readers to call our criminal justice system and how the prison system works into question. And I think inshallah ta'ala, maybe either the mastermind program or some other type of setting, we can have that discussion. Because I think it's a very important discussion to have. Because as you know, especially as Muslims, when we have our own values in regards to justice and how justice should be properly served and implemented. But with that, she starts going into she starts speaking about the ACLU and other civil rights groups, and she expresses her frustrations with those groups to the reader. How she feels that these civil rights groups are not making criminal justice reform their top priority, and she feels like that is a problem. And she draws a simile for the reader, this a parallel for us, and she asks the reader to consider that, to ask us to kind of imagine if back during the civil rights movement, if Jim Crow laws were not made the top priority for civil rights groups back then, how would things have changed? How would things have looked? Would the Civil Rights Act of 1965 even happen if there was not a social movement implemented to address this issue? And with that, she defines for us as readers what her main priority in this book is. What is the overall purpose of this book? Which is to argue that mass incarceration is metaphorically the new Jim Crow, and that those of us who care about social justice and care about social justice reform need to, one, acknowledge this, which she calls a fact, acknowledge this, and number two, to work towards dismantling this issue, right? And so those are the two main purposes of this book. One, to convince the reader, or in her view, to have the reader acknowledge the fact that mass incarcerations are a new form of Jim Crow. There's a new means for minorities, especially African American males, to be forced into a permanent social second-class status, and from there to push and encourage those who are passionate about social justice and want to work towards, true equality, to make this a priority for them. And so after that, that's basically the main points of the introduction. And from here, she just kind of goes into defining for us what she means by mass incarcerations, that she doesn't just mean people being thrown in prison, but she again highlights that the most damaging aspect of mass incarceration is not being thrown in prison, but what comes after. Like what we mentioned, having that on your permanent record, being denied employment, being denied social programs like food stamps, being denied the right to vote, and what have you. So she kind of highlights for us what she means by mass incarceration. That doesn't just mean a bunch of people being thrown in prison, in jail. And then from there, she just kind of goes into the different chapters, and she kind of explains for us the point of each chapter. And inshallah ta'ala, we're going to be going over each chapter together anyway, so I'm not going to waste anyone's time breaking down each of the chapters, since we're doing that together. And with that, the introduction ends before she goes into chapter 1, which is titled "The Rebirth of the Caste System," of the caste system. I'm sorry, which inshallah ta'ala we'll be going over next week. And that ends the introduction portion of this book. So just kind of share you guys with some personal reflections of mine, and then I really want to encourage everyone here to share their views and their perspectives. I found this introduction to be very engaging. I think she hits us with some pretty hard facts in order to kind of focus the conversation. And I felt it was really appropriate of her to address some potential arguments about mass incarceration before going into why this is a problem. And I just really am looking forward to further reading as to why she feels that calling it a caste system is the most appropriate way. Because she even acknowledges in the introduction that calling it a caste system may sound like a very strong word for saying that it's the system that forces minorities into lesser status than whites. And on the surface, that just sounds like a very strong claim, right? And while she addresses it somewhat, I'm very interested in reading the next chapter, which is titled The New Caste System, where she goes into detail as to why she is calling this issue of mass incarceration effectively a new type of racial caste system. But with that, is there anyone who wanted to share some other points in the introduction that they felt is worth mentioning? Sister Vina, I see you have your hand up.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
I think one of the things that, and I'm still going through the introduction, I guess I'm a slow reader these days, but one of the things that I found just unbelievable, but not unbelievable the way things are, where she was talking about the war on drugs and that there were some conspiracy theories floating around in the streets, and she dismissed them pretty much because they were, conspiracy theories. But then it turned out that they were right, partially right. And she talks about how the CIA admitted, that they were supporting armies in Nicaragua who were smuggling illegal drugs into the US, and they were making their way into the streets of the Black neighborhoods in the form of crack cocaine. So the CIA knew that this was going on and was part of this. And I think that it's just telling, it's very similar to what is happening today when we look at the protests and what's happening, where there's conspiracy theories happening and photo ops happening that are pushing the agenda of the current administration, where it's the fault of the people and not the fault of the government. And the government is, everything's just fine and dandy with the government, but when the reality is that they're really instigating. And it's just another example of, keeping these African-American communities where they want them to be. Basically, that's the point. And I was literally infuriated when I read. I think I had heard this a long time ago, and I just had forgotten about it. But it's infuriating that the government itself was actively involved in the war on drugs.
No, absolutely. And I thank you, Sister Vina, for mentioning that, because your brother has to. You have your
yeah. Just my quick comment is that regarding this war on drugs and mass incarceration, we is a general perception, especially among Muslims, that the Republicans and conservatives are the one who push for all those. But in this case, this war on drugs and mass incarceration, this is a bipartisan. So we saw that both Democrat and Republicans, they are equally advocated this, the top leadership. Right now, the presidential candidate, Joe Biden, is the one who, I believe in 1994, he's the one who presented that 30 strike bill. So my observation is that this is a bipartisan mess, and we cannot blame just one party for this one.
No, you're absolutely right, Brother Hasib. Just to kind of add on to that, I think many of you know this, but Bill Clinton also implemented a lot of criminal justice laws, which further contributed to this mass incarceration problem, such as minimum sentencing laws and what have you. Who, of course, was a Democrat and a very beloved Democratic president at that. To the point where even I think recently he acknowledged that his actions further contributed to this issue. But like brother Hasib said, that this issue of the war on drug mass incarceration, this was a bipartisan effort, right? This is not something that's a Democrat or Republican issue, and I really think it's important for everyone to know that, because I see a lot of people, even Muslims, who, because they're more conservative, they feel like they have to deny. Oh, there's no such thing as systematic racism. That doesn't exist. That's just a liberal bias. Like, this is not a partisan issue. This should not be a partisan issue. And so I think it is important for us to kind of mention, like what the Hasib did, that where we are now is not done by one particular political party. It was a bipartisan effort. But in regards to what Sister Vina said, I also found that part about how the CIA basically not just turned a blind eye, but supported a guerrilla faction in Nicaragua that was bringing in crack cocaine into the impoverished African American communities. It kind of just makes you have to just kind of take a step back and just really, we can't always take everything at face value. I think it's always important for us to make sure that we keep an eye on our leadership, our government, and hold them accountable. And it's very easy, I think, to lose sight of that, because our government does a very good job of dividing us on a very minuscule, irrelevant issue. So, for example, just a little bit off tangent, the mask issue, wearing a mask in public. This is not something that should be partisan. Yet, but somehow, due to the overwhelming talent of our government, wearing a mask has somehow become a partisan issue, and now we have people divided over something as insignificant as wearing a mask. And I think it's very important for us not to get caught up in these little partisan battles. Instead, focus on the big picture. We need to hold our leadership as a whole accountable, right? But on that, is there anyone else that wants to share something? Anyone else had a chance to read the introduction and wants to share another part from it that perhaps I didn't mention? Or if you didn't have a chance to read the introduction, is there a reflection you want to share in regards to what we went over today? So, for example, here's a question for all of you in terms of what we went over today. What are some, because remember, this book was written back in 2010, even though a lot of the data in it is still very relevant. But let me ask you guys this: what are some parallels that you can find in regards to some of the facts that she shared with us today in regards to racial discrimination and disproportionate incarcerations to the issues that we see today? What are some parallels that you guys see?
I missed it. I didn't quite understand what you said. What parallels?
No, Jeffrey, I'm saying in regards to some of the points that she made in the introduction back in 2010, what are some parallels that you see today? Basically, some issues that you see today that are very similar, if not the same, to what she mentioned back in 2010.
Oh, I gotta remember. Well, basically, people of color are always presumed a threat or guilty before they're presumed innocent. You guys were talking about the drug war. Yeah, but that was all part of the in the beginning years. Well, they've been doing that since the 1930s when the quote unquote mobs from Europe were coming over. Their desire was to push drugs in the Black community or communities of color to keep them under control and make money, of course. So when we assess how we deal with drugs and law enforcement licenses, the similarities have not changed over a course of a couple of centuries. It's that you have to control your work, the people that you consider your labor force, and you have to control whoever is in control of the wealth or the direction of wealth of the country, of your particular area, is the people that want to make it to make that so. And that's not uncommon to what we're seeing today. I said, what we see today is really no different than what we see in the 1860s, when people of color, not just blacks, but people of color, whether they're black or brown, when they start to grasp power, then those who already have it are not going to give it up easily. They will come up with solutions to not share it, not integrate it, or to make it difficult for you to to obtain it, whether it's voting restrictions. But in our case, in the 21st century, voter suppression and incarceration. Incarceration is the best 13th Amendment, because as soon as a prime example, I missed it probably in the beginning. The prime example of parallels that I see now is the legislation they have in Florida. You guys probably have talked. I got in there late. Is the legislation that they've done in the state of Florida, where you serve your time, you pay your debts to society, but now you still can't vote.
You can. Yeah, we didn't mention before. We didn't mention.
Yeah, because I came in late, so I don't know where we're at, but those parameters haven't really changed. I admit that Miss Alexander, she brought those to light, but these are parameters, actions and parameters that have not changed since Reconstruction, basically. They haven't changed that. They take different forms, or they take different methodologies, but these are no different than I said. These things have not changed since the 1870s, when slaves actually could vote and could obtain some power or control over their destinies. Since what is that guy that came after Lincoln?
John Wilkes Booth?
Yeah, no, not Booth, the president.
That came after Lincoln. I thought you meant like
after, yeah, not after him, but the president that was elected after Lincoln. God, I can't think of his name now, but he made the compromise with the Southern, at that time, the Southern Democrats, so that because his election was decided in Congress because it was so close. Can't think of his name, Ruth or something was his name, but because, and I'll look it up again, but because this president after Lincoln wanted to become president, and the vote was so tight, he had to make a compromise with the Southern Democrats to vote for him so that he could become president, and he was able to do that in what we call, the modern day times, we call states' rights, which meant that the Southern states could go back and interact the kinds of states laws that would be oppressive to former slaves or people of color. So this, her book, I said, I looked at this a couple of years. I went through this book a couple of years ago, so I'm a little behind some of the latest version, but the methodologies still seem to be the same over the course of the last 200 years. I mean, the purpose still be the same. The methodology seems to change to fit, you know, the particular, our particular realm. Now it's voter suppression and mass incarceration, but they were doing that. They've been doing that since the 1870s. This is not new. It's just that now we have the ability to see it.
No, absolutely. And she also mentions the same thing, that basically, um, while the methodology has changed, the overall purpose has not. I'm sure. I actually didn't know that by the 1930s.
Oh, yeah. That's the drug wars were prevalent back then, but now it was then to keep the urban or ghettos, as we call it, to keep them under control. And that was basically done by the mobsters, the European mobsters coming, you know, like from the Italians and the whatever, you know, Sicily. I remember being in Europe, the first thing they would, being in Italy, near Rome and Venice, and the first thing they would say is, don't make Sicily kind of jokes. Don't even joke about the mob. You know, don't make mob jokes when you're in Italy, especially where we were in, like near Venice or Rome and whatever. So I'm gonna look up those presidents, because I every time I think about it, I get mad. I just gotta look them up while we're talking.
You're not talking about Grant, are you?
No, not Grant. No, Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes. That's it. Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes. That was the compromise, because the election, I think this was 1868 or 9, right in there, right in that time frame. The election was so close that you know, they had to go into Congress to decide who's going to be president. And Rutherford B. Hayes said, look, well, to the Southern senators, that, hey, you know, if you make me president, I'll allow you to just run I'll step away from putting any restrictions on states. Basically, I'm going to let you do states' rights, which meant we're going to, you know, you can run your state the way you want, which led to what we now call Jim Crow and you know, the Jim Crow laws, and that we study in history today. Rutherford B. Hayes, that's who it was.
It's very interesting, Brother Jeffrey. Me and inshallah one day we'll have to have you do an embrace history lesson, inshallah, to educate us on all these things. Because I definitely didn't know that.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry for the rant, but I got in here late. I'm sorry for the rant, guys. Sorry.
No, you're good. I think you taught us something very interesting, very important. So thank you for that. Even Sister Vina is giving you the thumbs up, inshallah. But we got about 9 more minutes. So I wanted to ask one more question to everyone, and that's going to be in regards to what Michelle Alexander speaks about in regards to the prison system. Like I mentioned previously, she calls into question the effectiveness of the prison system and cites for us some scholars who highlighted that the prison system, in their view, was ineffective, that it had a higher chance, it would actually increase crime instead of decreasing it, and that it was overall not solving the problem. And so what I wanted to ask everyone is, what are your views on our current prison system? Do you think it's perfect? Do you think that it's ineffective? Do you think it is effective? What are some ways you think it could be done better? I think it's really good to have discussions like that, because I think it's through discussions like this that we can truly have productive and positive change in our society. All right, Sister Vina, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, me again. So I don't know if I'm able to get my point across or not, but I'm going to try, because over the years, my view on prison has changed, and it's basically due to like the education and learning about what really happens in the prison system. And what I think would be better, and I'm hoping that the future could possibly hold something like this is, like, if you look at the prison system now and the disproportionate amount of African Americans that are in there, and the reason why that this whole system was set up that way, then looking at the conditions within the prisons themselves are not conducive to anybody coming out of there with any kind of any way to really jump back into society as an active member, based on what's happening every day. It's survival. It's survival in the prisons. You know, it's not a rosy, you know, hotel where you're staying for, 25 years or so. You are in a very small room, or you're in a room with lots and lots of other people. I know that there are certain people that need to be removed from society, but do they need to be removed from society and dehumanized at the same time? You know, they've committed horrible crimes, but they're still human. And I think that they have rights as humans to dignity and respect, even though they've done something horrible. Yes, they should be removed from the current society, but not put into a situation where they're treated as if they're an animal. So I think the future would be looking at a better way to work with the prison system. And I think that maybe that would reduce the amount of prisoners over time that are in the prisons, although it is a big business here in the United States. So there's that as well.
Very good points, Sister Vina. And just to kind of further add to that, because you mentioned that, yeah, there are some people, individuals who need to be removed from society due to their crimes. But we also have to understand that the majority of people who are incarcerated are due to non-violent crimes. I think the issue of tackling violent crime is another discussion in and of itself. But we also have to understand that the majority of people who are incarcerated and put in prison are due to non-violent crimes.
Exactly.
And I'd like to mention, Sister Vina, these people are basically dehumanized. They are treated as animals. And I think we as a society are kind of taught to view them that way, right? To view them as less than human, regardless of whatever crime they committed. What matters is that they are a criminal and they need to be treated as such, aka treated as less than human. And I think it's very important for us to question that, because I think something you have to ask yourself: if you treat someone as less than human, and then once they've fulfilled their debt to society and you release them, how do you think, what effect would you think that would have on their psyche? If you indoctrinate someone to believe that you are less than human, you are trash, you are this, would that cause them to act act as such? Cause them to act as if, since they are less than human, they need to act less than human? I think it's really important questions for us to ask ourselves. Sister Jennifer said, I have a completely different perspective on criminals who commit violent crimes. Sister Jennifer, did you want to share that with us, or just have that posted there? Okay, no problem. Is there anyone else that wanted to share their thoughts on this particular topic, their thoughts on the effectiveness of the prison system, critiques? Guys, it's supposed to be a discussion. I want to hear y'all's voices. Brother Saad, I know you probably have a lot to say, mashallah.
Alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.
I don't know that much about the prison system. Like I said, I feel like my life, I've always been in a bubble, but my daughter-in-law, her father is one of the HLF 5, the, Holy Land Foundation that were put in jail. And they only because when I think 9/11, and then they had the they looked at them that the Holy Land Foundation that were giving money to Palestine were a terrorist group, and they and people, and so they were like in charge of these groups, and so he got, you know, he's been incarcerated for I think 12 years, and he has like another 2 years left. And him and the others didn't do anything that you know should cause them to go in jail. And you know, it's just and I just hear from her side, you know, how, you know, they keep moving them from, you know, like from prison to prison. So when the family can go visit them like once in whatever, a month or something like that, but they have to they just keep moving them from state to state. And you know, I don't know how they're treated, but I know one of them just got the COVID, and they weren't going to move him, separate him, and I know a lot of them are from actually Dallas, I think, from those HLF5. Have you heard of them?
I have not.
HLF5, you said?
Yeah.
Yes, the Holy Land Foundation.
Oh, yeah. What?
I think
Yeah.
I've heard the name before.
Wasn't there something about one of the mosques that was in Carrollton that they were? I think this is a few years.
I don't know the details of it because it was so long ago. But like, you know, I know that my daughter-in-law's, you know, her.
Mhm.
He had basically one of the least amount of time. But then most likely when he gets out, they're most likely going to deport him because he's not an American citizen. No.
And that's the other thing. In America, we have a two prison system. The one, the brick and mortar. But then when you come out, and I hear it all the time, your second sentence is if you manage to get out, you serve a second sentence because you're absolutely cut off from the rest of society. You can't get a job, you can't live in housing, nor can your family, nor can your families if they have any governmental system, nor can your family touch you because you know, if you're a felon or whatever, they'll cut your family off from you and cut your family's resources off because you're the felon, and that makes it a second prison term. One they serve inside the prison, and the other is when they serve outside the prison. So,
a very good point, Brother Shippy. Hence why I think Michelle Alexander calls mass incarceration not just being in prison, but what comes after, and why she includes what comes after as part of her definition of mass incarceration.
right.
So very good point. All right, guys, it is now 8:01, so inshallah ta'ala we'll go ahead and close. So next week, inshallah, we'll be going over chapter 1. Again, I encourage all of you to, if you don't have the book, you can get up off of Amazon for Kindle, $10. I heavily encourage all of you to buy the book, read the chapters ahead of time, so that way we can really have a collective discussion. I really want to hear what y'all's perspectives are and what and how the chapter, what your own personal perspective. I think you guys can do a much better job than inshallah. Before we close, I just have a quick announcement. So on this Sunday, inshallah ta'ala, we are having a collaborative program with ICNA CSJ, Council of Social Justice, and NYM, as well as the Imam Jamil Action Network, for awareness raising program about the unjust incarceration of Imam Jamil Al-Amin. You guys have probably seen the posts about him for the past couple of weeks. He is formerly known as H. Rap Brown. He was a civil rights icon back in the day. He's been unjustly incarcerated for the past 20 years for a crime that he very well may not have committed. Someone else is actually committed to this crime, but court refuses to basically reopen the case. So we're really trying to raise awareness for his incarceration and trying to really push for him to have a retrial. Again, 20 years, guys, 20 years being stuck in a prison, being treated like we were talking about, being treated less than he went through. I don't even want to go into the type of atrocity he went through while he was in prison, but for a crime that you didn't commit. And this is someone, Imam Jamil, I don't want to take up some time, but he did so much for his community at West End, and he basically helped transform his community from being full of prostitution and drug use to more of, a place of faith, a place of productivity. He did so much for his community. And on top of that, he's our brother in Islam. We have to, this is something that we really have to address. So I really encourage all of you to, if you want to learn more about this issue, 6 p.m., I think 6 p.m. Central Time. 6 p.m. Eastern Time. That's going to be 5 p.m. Central Time this Sunday. We're going to have Imam Holly Griggs, Sheikh Omar Suleiman, and his son, Brother Kadi Elmi, on this program. Please do come, raise awareness, and be part of this effort, inshallah. Sister Vina, did you want to add something?
I did. I think that it's just parallels this conversation a little bit, thinking about the journey of Imam Jamil, and that, here he was an amazing civil rights person in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, really fighting for the rights of the African American community and doing a great job, and was silenced by being put in prison, set up. I read the book where they tried their best and hardest to get him into prison, where he was unable to then continue his amazing work, uplifting his community. So this is just another piece of the puzzle. And I really hope people stop by and view the webinar, because it's really important for us to support him. He's elderly now. He needs to come home to be with his family.
Right. And we've only scratched the surface, guys. I think in the webinar, you guys learn a lot more about Imam Jamil, about his incarceration, and what we can do to really address this issue and help get him home, inshallah. So again, please do make time to come, share the flyer to try and really make sure we have a good amount of people working towards this, inshallah. So with that, we'll go ahead and close. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Jazakumullahu khairan, wa assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.